Arrival of the Honorable Senate President and the Senators of the Republic.
The 50th session of the second regular session of the 19th Congress is hereby called to order. Today, we are supposed to be led in prayer by Senator Bongo. Is he? Nandiyan ba? Nandiyan ba? We can ask Senator Bongo to lead the prayer tomorrow. Today, we'll ask our majority floor leader to lead us in prayer, which I think is timely.
Let's put ourselves in the presence of our Lord, Heavenly Father, the Creator of the universe, who said, if there are 2 or 3 gathering together in His name, He is in their midst. We come before you, humbling ourselves, respecting your presence, acknowledging that without you, we can do nothing. Apart from you, we are nobody. But if you are with us, no one, nothing, no circumstances here on earth can be against us. Today, we ask for the forgiveness of our sins in words, in thoughts, and in deeds. Allow us, Lord, to do our part as you have called us to serve the best interests of our country and people. Bless the works of our hands. Bless every member of the Senate and even every employee of this great institution. Allow us, Lord, to fulfill your divine calling in serving the best interests of our kababayans from Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao, and even outside this country. We love you and praise you. Bless our beloved country, the Philippines, and into your hands we commend everything as we carefully give back to you all the glory, all the honor and praise in the name that is above every name. In the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Everybody agree and say amen.
Amen. Sanbong, bukas ka na lang prayer. Oh, tama. Secretary, please call the roll of members.
Call of members, the Honorable Senator Angara, Senator Binay, Senator Cayetano Alan, Senator Cayetano Pia, Senator De La Rosa, Senator Ejercito, Senator Escudero, Senator Estrada, Senator Gatchalian, Senator Go, Senator Ontiveros, Senator Lapid, Senator Legarda, Senator Marcos, Senator Padilla, Senator Pimentel, Senator Poe, Senator Revilla, Senator Tolentino, Senator Tulfo, Senator Villanueva, Senator Villar Cynthia, Senator Villar Mark, the Senate President.
With 20 senators present, the chair declares the presence of a quorum.
Mr. President, before we proceed, may we just acknowledge some guests from the gallery. Guests of Senator Alan Cayetano, officials of the Metro Manila District Jail, Annex 5 in Camp Bagong Diwa, Taguig, led by Jail Chief Inspector Percival Valenzuela. Also with us, Mr. President, guests of the Senate, Santo Niño Senior High School students from Parañaque City. We welcome all of you in this August chamber.
Yes,
Mr.
welcome to
President,
your Senate. Welcome to your Senate, especially the students.
We
sa mga
also
estudyante.
have with us, Mr. President, Miss Gwendolyn Fornial, who was crowned Miss World Philippines 2022. We wish her all the best as she will represent the country, the Philippines, in the upcoming Miss World competition in India. We welcome our distinguished guests.
Yes, to Miss Gwendolyn Forniol, welcome to the Senate. Marami pa tayong mga binata dito. Mga binata. Nandyan, katabi ni Ma'am Cynthia.
Mr. President, at this juncture, I move that we dispense with the reading of the Journal of the 49th Session, Monday, February 12, 2024, and consider the same as approved. So move, Mr. President.
There being no objection, the motion is approved.
At this juncture, Mr. President, I move that we proceed with the reference of business.
There being no objection, Secretary, please proceed with the reference of business.
Bill on first reading, Senate number 2545, governing civil liability and compensation claims for nuclear damage, repealing for the purpose certain sections of RA 5207 as amended. Senator Tolentino.
The Committee on Science and Technology, Energy and Finance.
Resolution, proposed Senate Resolution 928, calling for the Senate Committee on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs to conduct an investigation into the circumstances leading to the arrest and detention of Director Jade Castro and his three companions for allegedly torching a modernized jeepney in Catanawan, Quezon, with the end in view of determining whether our law enforcement officers continue to adhere to well-established rules and regulations in the performance of their duties and proposing additional remedial measures. Senator Ontiveros.
To the Committee on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs. Please proceed with the additional reference of business.
Additional reference of business. Messages from the House. Letter from the House informing the Senate that on 23 January 2024, it passed the following House bills in which it requests the concurrence of the Senate. House number 7514, establishing a district office of the LTO in Liloy, Zamboanga del Norte. 9649, converting the extension office of the LTO in Naguilian, La Union into a Class D district office. 9650, converting the extension office of the LTO in Taguig City into a regular district office. 9651, creating a regular LTO district office in Pili, Camarines Sur. 9652, establishing a district office of the LTO in Ubay, 2nd District, Bohol. 9653, converting the district office of the LTO in San Carlos City, Pangasinan into a Class B district office. 9654, establishing a district office of the LTO in Calamansig, Sultan Kudarat. 9655, converting the LTO district office in Naga City, Camarines Sur into a regular Class A district office. 9664, establishing a district office of the LTO in Ilog, Negros Occidental.
To the Committees on Public Service and Finance.
House number 7601, establishing a multi-species marine hatchery in Ormoc, Leyte. 9705, multi-species freshwater hatchery, Calamansig, Sultan Kudarat. 9706, multi-species marine hatchery, Tarangan, Samar. 9707, multi-species marine hatchery, Umualbual, Cebu. 9719, establishing a central multi-species marine hatchery in Kawayan, Negros Occidental, and appropriating funds therefor.
To the Committees on Agriculture, Food and Finance.
9708, establishing a fish port with ice plant and cold storage facilities in Gutalac, Zamboanga del Norte, appropriating funds therefor. And House number 9709, establishing a fish port with ice plant and cold storage in the municipality of Cebuco, Zamboanga del Norte, appropriating funds therefor.
To the Committee on Agriculture, Public Works and Finance.
9642, converting the Aurora State College of Technology in Baler, Aurora into a state university, appropriating funds therefor.
To the Committee on Higher Technical Vocational Education, Ways and Means of Finance.
9643, establishing a TESDA Training and Assessment Center in Libo, Dinagat Islands, appropriating funds therefor.
To the Committees on Higher Technical Vocational Education, Finance.
9438, declaring the immediate environs of Sultan Haji Hassanal Bolkiah Masjid, also known as the Grand Mosque of Cotabato, in Barangay Kalangan, Cotabato City, as tourism destination.
To
How-
the co-
Yes, sir.
To the Committee on Tourism and Finance.
House number 9669, renumbering the district engineering offices of the Department of Public Works and Highways in Davao de Oro.
To the Committee on Public Works.
9720, upgrading the Oriental Mindoro Provincial Hospital in Calapan, Oriental Mindoro into a regional hospital to be known as the Mimaropa Regional Hospital, appropriating funds therefor.
To the Committee on Health and Demography and Finance.
9713, institutionalizing a Philippine self-reliant defense posture program and promoting the development of a national defense industry pursuant thereto.
To the Committee on Rules.
House number 9571, prohibiting the development, production, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons, providing for their destruction and imposing penalties for violations thereof.
To the Committee on National Defense, Peace and Unification.
Letter from the House informing the Senate that on 22 January 2024, it designated Representative Briones as additional conferee to the Bicameral Conference Committee on the disagreeing provisions of House Number 9284, House Number 3917, and Senate Number 2432.
To the Committee on Rules. Before I call the Majority Floor Leader, my dear colleagues, last night I was Speaker, Guest of Honor of the Consular Corps of the Philippines, and I spoke to several of our ambassadors and members of the Consular Corps that apparently we lack facilities, particularly health facilities, in our major tourist areas. I also happened to sit beside Bea Zobel, who is the consul for Mimaropa for the Spanish Embassy, and she told me over the weekend one of the Spanish guests, tourists, got the Benz, and there was wala po si Coron, wala pong hyperbaric chamber. How can we invite tourists, my dear colleagues, to enjoy the dive spots and beautiful beaches here and promote it as a diving center for diving, because we have one of the best biodiversity-rich areas in Asia, and yet we do not have the facilities when an accident happens. Another incident where the Spanish gentleman broke his collarbone. He was a doctor. They brought him to the hospital in Palawan, in Coron. I think it was also Coron. They had nothing in the hospital. He had to set the bone back himself together with his friend and get airlifted to Metro Manila to put it on a cast. And that is the problem that I foresee here. Maybe we can come up with I'll file a resolution. Maybe the members would like to co-sponsor with me, directing the Committee on Health, Committee on Tourism, joint committee hearing on these areas. And the ambassadors were saying, even if we just prioritize the top 4 tourist areas, which is Palawan, Siargao, Boracay, and they named another. Kasi in Palawan, dalawa yan eh. You have El Nido and then you have Coron. So those 4 areas, I think it would be the best initiative for the Senate to take. Senator Angara is recognized.
I'm just asking for the details from the budget office, but because I remember a few years ago, Mr. President, I was discussing with Senator Binay. There was a famous media personality who went to Siargao with her family. And
Tago
her son
natin sa
was...
pangalan, Karen Davila. Yes, yes.
I wasn't planning to mention her name, but...
It's a
but
very
yes, you're correct, Mr.
very
President.
big issue.
Her son was injured surfing, and they had to, I think, they had a hard time finding a health facility. So as a result of that, the Senate put an amendment, I'm just not sure which year, but we're funding a health clinic there
Yes.
to treat first aid injuries for the tourists, because Siargao is growing as a tourist destination, Mr. President.
Actually, the problem was not on the facility, but the lack of, not the building,
Yeah.
but on the lack of equipment on the facility and the doctors. Kasi
Yeah.
apparently, these are provincial hospitals.
These are associated problems, Mr. President.
Yes,
That's
yes.
why we passed the Dr. Para sa Bayan. Senator Pia has the bill
Yes.
on allied medical professions for nurses, that we give scholarships to deserving students in state colleges for the allied, not just doctors, because we already
Yes.
passed the Dr. Para sa Bayan, sponsored by our majority leader and our colleagues. So yung problema ng nurse, they're required as exchange for the scholarship. They have to give return service
Yes.
in the public medical facilities, Mr. President.
Is it possible,
So,
Your Honor, you're the chairman of the Committee on Finance, we'll discuss it with tourism and health. Is it possible that we can make these extensions of the regional hospital para
I'm
DOH
sure it's
can
possible,
manage
Mr.
it?
President.
Yes.
I think that's a very good suggestion. I
The
think it's
4
possible.
areas, at least DOH
Yeah.
ang magmamanage.
I think that's a very good suggestion.
Their complaint was the provincial hospital had nothing. So
Yeah.
that's, and it's,
But,
they're,
I think
resources are-
the deeper problem there, Mr. President, is that health was devolved under the local government code.
yes.
That's why many provincial governments, including my province, they're struggling with funding the requirements of the province. That's
Yes.
why some provinces are moving for renationalization,
Renationalization.
going back to the national. So yun ang problema.
Oo.
It's a deep structural problem, Mr. President. I think maybe you involve the Committee on Local Government, because if
Yes.
that is not solved, Di ba nung pumasok yung pandemic, wala tayong boots on the ground. Yun ang sabi ng DOH.
That's
That's
correct.
why we had a hard time recording. We had to rely on DILG. We had to rely on barangay officials for contact tracing, things like that. It's
That's
because
correct.
walang nationwide grassroots network ang DOH, Mr. President, as a
You're
result
absolutely
of the Local Government Code of 1991.
You're absolutely correct. So
Thank you. Thank you.
we'll file a resolution, and hopefully all of you can help me co-sponsor this.
Mr. President, the Senate President Pro Tem, Senator Ligard, is also
Yes.
seeking the floor. I move that she be recognized, Mr. President.
Our Senate President pro tempore, Senator Lorna Garda, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President, for bringing that to our attention once again, and I support and would like to associate with that measure as well as that of the Senate Finance Committee, because it's been a perennial problem, and it's about time that it has a whole of Senate approach,
Yes.
so that not only one or two senators will make it an amendment, but actually a whole Senate amendment. We take note of the need for tourism. However, this also, of course, would address the local needs, because we mentioned about foreigners and famous personalities whose families are affected and there's no health care at all or no hospitals. But what about the locals? They live there 365 days in a year, and it is completely absent in their local communities. So it
Agree.
would address not just two, but all needs, the
Yes.
local needs of the communities and the tourism needs, and both for domestic and foreign tourism. I would like to state this, and it's a perennial problem of DOH, not just of this administration, that they construct, perhaps by GAA amendments of legislators, structures. And it takes time, perhaps forever, for the equipment to come in. And even if there's a structure and equipment, they have to lobby for the provision of qualified personnel, doctors and nurses, to man the super health centers, the polyclinics, and the community hospitals. So it takes several years. So if the DOH could give us, in a briefing in the Senate, a complete mapping of all the district, provincial, regional hospitals, the super health centers, which used to be called polyclinics, the barangay health stations, and the RHUs, ano ang may gusali na wala naman gamit? Ano ang mga may gamit na sira-sira ang gusali? Or meron bago, wala naman taong magmaman? Alam ko rin na may mga probinsya, may mga dialysis centers, wala naman qualified personnel na magman ng mga dialysis units. So, I'm sorry to bring this to your attention. It becomes even a bigger problem, because what you wanted to focus on was putting hospitals in designated tourism areas. But I think it's about time that the DOH gives us a complete picture of the health facilities under the UHC, because that should have been solved eventually under our universal health care program. So I put that on the table, and I hope that when we designate the DOH to support, I would consider it your motion on to provide not just the infrastructure, but also the equipment and the qualified medical personnel in those areas that you mentioned. They could also give us what are the others in different regions of the country. Maaring walang turismo, pero matagal na nag-aantay ang mga kababayan natin na titingin na lang sa struktura na wala naman mga gamit. So having said that, I would like to associate myself with your views and that of the Senate Finance Chair. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Actually, dear colleagues, we can even designate them as tourism hospitals and tourist hospitals, because you're not only catering to international tourists, you're also catering to local tourists, like what happened to the son of Karen Davila in Siargao. At the same time, you're absolutely correct, it can be used by the locals. So if you look, we can file a bill after the hearings and come up with a bill called the Tourist Hospital Program, or some sort of program of the DOH, wherein these areas where there are provincial hospitals can be renationalized to the regional hospitals. So mabigyan po ng tao, it will be manned by the regional hospitals. And we can put state-of-the-art facilities, hyperbaric chambers, magkano lang naman yan. Because we offered, and I know Senator Angara is familiar with this, we offered last night, I said, okay, next year we'll add budget for hyperbaric chambers. You know what they told me? Sir, it's useless, because there are hyperbaric chambers that they don't know how to use. They don't know how to maintain it, and they're actually deteriorating. So I even thought of the idea, why don't we tie up with the Philippine Navy, since there's Navy commands in these areas. Pero if we have a tourism hospital, a tourist hospital that can man the hyperbaric chambers, even better. Senator Angara's recommendation.
Yes, apologies for taking the floor once again, Mr. President, but I just got the information that the Senate placed amendments in the 2022 General Appropriations Act or budget. We funded the Siargao Island Medical Center to the tune of 225 million. That's a Senate amendment. As well as we funded a sea ambulance to General Luna, Surigao del Norte, which is the municipality which covers Siargao.
That's wonderful.
Which is one of the fastest rising tourist destinations in the country to the amount of 3.5 million. Just to place it on record, Mr.
Wonderful. That means the Senate is really acting on it. We just have to make sure that it is implemented properly and it's being utilized. Yeah.
Thank
So,
you, Mr.
thank
President. Just to put
Majority
on record my interest to be associated with the statements made by our Senate President Pro Temp and Finance Chair and our Senate President. I just had a meeting before this session with the Regional Director of our DOH in Region 3, Mr. President, and that's why it's really important to look into this, and we will continue to submit to the leadership of our Senate President in pushing for these initiatives, Mr. President.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before we proceed, Mr. President, as mentioned by this representation, our Regional Director from DOH Region 3 is here with us, R.D. Corazon Flores of DOH Region 3, and also Regional Director Crisma Rodriguez of the Department of Tourism, guest of Senator Ligarda, is also with us. We welcome both of them in this
Welcome.
August chamber.
Welcome to the Senate. Welcome to your Senate.
Mr. President,
Mr. President, if I may.
Oh, yes, Senator Bongo.
As chairman po ng Committee on Health, ako po yung principal sponsor ng Siargao Island Medical Center, Republic Act 11500, establishing a new DOH hospital in Siargao. Ito po yung pinondohan ng ating chairman, no, si Senator Angara. At gusto ko rin pong banggitin about dito sa mga planong hospital sa tourist spots, no. Meron pong napondohan noong 2022 na mga super health centers all around the country, no. Nakakalat po 'yan sa mga strategic areas including Malay, sa Aklan. It's a medium type of a polyclinic. Pwede po dyan yung mga minor cases, pwede po dyan yung konsulta, dyan na po yung primary care ng universal health care, even buntis. Pwedeng mga anak dyan kung emergency na mga turista, buntis, kailangan nilang mga anak. Hindi na nila kailangan magbiyahe ng malalayong lugar. About 600 super health centers po ang ongoing na ginagawa or gagawin pa po for 2 to 3 years. And in fact, for this year, meron din pong allotted from World Bank. Yung sa mga DIDA, yung mga identified na mga mahihirap na provinces ay lalagyan rin po. I'm sure marami dyan ay mga tourist destinations rin po. Salamat, Mr. President.
Yes, just one question, Senator Bongo. Yung dun sa tinayo po, pinasa po natin na Siargao Health Hospital in Siargao, yan ay DOH run na siya, hindi siya provincial hospital.
Yes, DOH na po siya.
DOH siya, very good.
From, I think from province na naging DOH na po siya.
Thank you for that information. Maraming
With
salamat.
your support po nung during the 18th Congress.
Thank you, sir.
thank you,
Salamat.
Senator Bongo. Thank you, Senate President Zubiri. And it goes to show that the Senate is sensitive to the needs of our people because as mentioned by Senator Bongo, ang nagpondo po nito ay Senado na
Yes.
laging handang tumulong sa ating mga distrito at sa mga lugar na kung saan ay hindi napopondohan para po masiguro na meron tayong maibibigay sa ating mga kababayan na nangangailangan. And I think the records is very clear, Mr. President, na ang Senado po ang tumulong na mapondohan ang mga district hospitals na ito.
Amen,
Maraming salamat,
amen,
Mr.
amen.
President. Mr. President, sorry, Mr. President, Senator Jinggoy wanted to say something, but he'd rather keep it to himself muna daw, Mr. President. Mr. President, this juncture, I move that we resume consideration of Senate Bill number 2534 under Committee Report number 190. This is the bill on the 100 pesos Daily Minimum Wage Increase Act. I so move, Mr. President.
There being no objection, motion is approved.
Mr. President, the parliamentary status of the measure is that we have sponsored the bill, and with that, I move to open the period of interpellations and debate and recognize the distinguished sponsor of the measure, Senator Jinggoy Ejercito Estrada, and to interpellate the gentleman from Cavite, Senator Ramon Bong Revilla Jr.
The gentleman, the sponsor, Senator Jingo Estrada, our distinguished colleague from the city of San Juan, is recognized, and to interpolate, a distinguished colleague from the province of Cavite, Senator Bong Revilla.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, nagpapasalamat po tayo sa ating mabuting kaibigan, the sponsor, Senator Jingo Estrada, sa kanyang kasipagan upang finally maitawid na natin ang pangarap na ito ng ating mga kababayan. And of course, I would like to thank the Senate President for pushing this measure. Talaga namang napakahalaga para sa ating mga kababayan ito. Sabi nga long overdue na ito, itong wage hike na ito. Alam nyo, bagito pa lang akong senador at ngayon ay senior senator na tayo dito. Ngayon lang nabigyan ng pagkakataong ito. Sana ito hindi na panaginip at bangungot lamang. Sana ay maging totoo na ito. On this note, will the good gentleman from San Juan, my best friend, my good friend, yield to some clarificatory questions, Mr. President?
Definitely, Mr. President. How can I refuse my kakosa, Mr. President?
Okay, Mr. President, ang tagal na po nating hinihingi itong increase na ito. Nung 14th Congress pa lang, nung 2008, kung hindi ako nagkakamali, no? 125 pesos na yung aumento ng sahod na hinihingi natin. Tapos, habang nagtatagal, umabot na ng 150 pesos yung gusto na sana nating i-increase. Bakit po naging 100 pesos lang ang proposed increase natin, Mr. President?
Thank you, Mr. President. The proposed increase of 100 pesos is based on the consultations made by the committee with including the stakeholders concerned. But the original proposal was 150 across the board. Ngunit marami pong umalma dito, particular na yung mga business establishments. If my memory serves me right, nagtaas yung Regional Wage Board ng 40 pesos dito sa Metro Manila. Nagkaroon ng wage hike dito sa Metro Manila ng 40 pesos, kaya naging 610 pesos. Ngayon, kung idadagdag natin yung 150, marami nang aalma ng mga business establishments. Kaya nilower down natin ng 100 pesos. I think that is more reasonable. And we took into consideration the increase granted by the regional wage boards, which ranges from 30 pesos to, I think, 89 pesos in most regions last year. Hence, the committee came up with the 100 peso increase only for the minimum wage earners. Only for the minimum wage earners across the board.
Okay. Kailan po ba tayo huling nakapagpasa ng batas para magkaroon ng across the board na aumento sa sahod ng ating mga manggagawa?
I think you were here during the last 13th Congress, no? When I passed the 125 pesos across the board here in the Senate. But unfortunately, it did not touch first base in the House, and I think they withdrew the bill in the House. First of all, they approved the bill in the House for a 125 peso across the board wage increase. Then when they elevated it, it reached in the Senate, I, as your chairman of the Committee on Labor, then again passed the same bill. Actually, we adopted the bill of the House of Representatives, but unfortunately, when we passed it, the House of Representatives, I do not know who among the congressmen there, withdrew their own bill. So, wala po nangyari. And it was in the 13th Congress when a bill proposing legislated wage hike progress in the Senate when this representation introduced and delivered a sponsorship speech for Senate Bill 2573, if I'm not mistaken, which proposed a 125 across-the-board wage increase. And in the 14th, 18th Congress, the following bills were filed in the previous Congresses, but remained pending in the before the committee. First of all, the 14th Congress, 125 across-the-board wage increase by this representation, former Senator Trillanes and Senator Revilla. In the 15th Congress, wala pong nag-file ng legislated wage hike. Sa 16th Congress, nag-file ulit ang si Senator Revilla ng 125 across the board. 17th Congress, wala po. At 18th Congress, masigasig po nag-file yung aking kaibigan, si Senator Revilla, ng 125 pesos across the board wage increase. And the last legislated wage hike was by virtue of Republic Act 6727, or the Wage Rationalization Act, Mr. President.
This was 34 years ago, Mr. President. Am I
Was
correct?
it 34 years ago? Yes, 1989. Yes, you're correct, Mr.
That's
President.
correct. So, magkano po ang naging increase noon compared to the prevailing minimum wage that time, Mr.
Well, ang
President?
prevailing daily minimum wage noon ay 69 pesos per day at nagkaroon ng 25 pesos increase pursuant to RA 6727, Mr. President.
Bali, ilang percent po ng minimum wage nung naging increase, Mr. President?
Well, approximately mga 40% ang increase.
39 to 40%.
Yes.
That's correct. Yes. With our current average minimum wage, Mr. President, ilang percent po ang average nung last increase among 17 regions?
Well, here in the NCR, the increase in percentage is approximately 7%. For areas outside the National Capital Region, the percent increases ranges from 6.7 in Region 6 and to 11.9% in Region 11, Mr. President.
Okay, may I ask, Mr. President, because we want to compare it, if we were progressing or are we regressing when it comes to the wage hike being granted to our workers? No? Yes, Mr. President. So nung 1989, upon the enactment of the Wage Rationalization Act, a 25 peso wage hike was implemented, thereby resulting in the non-agricultural basic wage of 89 pesos in all regions, at around 39.1% increase. Now, the current minimum wage in NCR for the non-agricultural sector is 610 pesos. With this in mind, factoring in the current inflation rate, does the current minimum wage have more purchasing power or lesser purchasing power, Mr. President?
Mr. President, the minimum wage in Metro Manila for the non-agricultural sector consistently recorded the highest basic pay in the country at 610 pesos per day. However, the actual daily pay is eroded by inflation, Mr. President, and the real value of the minimum wage, which reflects the inflation-adjusted rates using the Consumer Price Index, has fallen to 514 pesos and 50 centavos in the capital as of July 2023, and has further decreased to 504 pesos for October 2023. And this scenario is replicated across all regions. Biro mo yun, 610 pesos na tinatanggap araw-araw ng ating mga manggagawa. Ang purchasing power na lang nun hanggang ngayon, as we speak, is 504 pesos na lang. Therefore, the purchasing power is lesser. That's why I was prompted to file this bill dahil nakakaawa na itong mga manggagawa natin.
Tama, Mr. President. How much should a family of 5 earn in a day to be able to say that they are living within a living wage, Mr. President? So as far as we yet?
Mr. President,
Are we at?
we have not received any data regarding the current living wage, Mr. President. But on the other hand, if you are familiar with the Ibon Foundation of the University of the Philippines, calculated that as of January 2024, the family living wage in Metro Manila is 1,193 pesos compared to the current minimum wage of 610 pesos. So malaki ang disparity. And other regions are also around 1,100 to 1,200 compared to their minimum wage ranging from 381 pesos to 510 pesos only. So sa BARM, it is 2,026 compared to its minimum wage of 341. Kaya masyadong malaki po ang discrepancy.
Tama, Mr. President. So subukan lang po natin computein, ano? So magkano po bang estimated na pang-araw-araw na gastos ng pamilyang 5, no, na miyembro, yung family of 5? Magkano po ba ang bigas ngayon? 1 kilo, 35
Hindi ko alam,
pesos.
di kasi ako
Siguro yung
namimili ng
pinakamura,
bigas,
no? Pinakamura na yun, 35 pesos. Conservative po tayo dyan sa 1 kilo na yan. Parang di naman kasya yan sa buong maghapon. Pumunta naman tayo sa ulam. Kunwari ay tinola para may sabaw at mas marami pang makakain. So, magkano naman yung kalahating kilo ng manok? Halimbawa, magkano? 80 pesos. O, lalagyan mo pa ng sahog yan. Toyo ba? Ano ba nilalagay niyo? Mga gulay. Parang pati, sayote. Tulad mo, maalat kang kumain, Mr. President. So, yun. So sa tingin talagang Mr. President, talagang kahit na anong computation na gawin natin, talagang kulang at kulang. Kaya napakahalaga nitong sinusulong nyo ngayon, Mr. President. Kaya saludo ko sa iyo at na-fast track nyo ito at sana ay pagkapasa natin dito sa Senado ay maipasa na din agad sa lower house. Kaya hindi na kita pahihirapan, Mr. President. At baka mag-lose ka pa ng ilang weight dyan. At, hindi, basta ako'y saludo sa iyo, Mr. President, my best friend. Umasa kayo na kami po ay nakasuporta sa panukalang ito.
Maraming salamat po, Ginoong Pangulo. Konting kasagutan lang sa inyong katanungan. Yung mga binanggit niyong ulam, yung mga tinola, yung mga bigas, ito yung mga pang-araw-araw na pwedeng kainin ng masang Pilipino. Ano pa kaya kung gusto nyong umorder ng kare-kare,
Ayan.
mga mitsado, mga bulalo, mas mahal.
Patadalan mo na lang
itong
sila
mga
ng sahog niyan, Mr.
manggagawa,
President.
hindi siguro maka-afford na kumain ng mas masasarap o mas mahal na pagkain. Dahil nga limited lang yung kanilang kinikita, yung kanilang budget. Ang pinakamurang bigas, Ginoong Pangulo, sa aking pagkakaalam, ay nasa higit 50 pesos per kilo. So medyo may kamahalan. Mataas din po ang presyo ng iba pang bilihin. Dahil dito, hindi po sapat ang pagtaas ng sahod na ipinapanukala natin. Subalit, ito po ay ating tinatawag na middle ground upang mabigyan ng dagdag sahod ang mga tunay na nangangailangan sa ating lipunan, Ginoong Pangulo.
That's correct, Mr. President. Kaya maliban po dyan sa inyong nabanggit, talagang nakakaawa po ang ating ibang mga kababayan na iba dyan ay ulam na lang ay asin. No? Talagang kulang talaga. So, in this note, Mr. President, I thank you again at pinapasalamatan din natin ang ating Senate President sa pag-fast track ng panukalang ito. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Senator Bong-Revilla, Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Next to interpolate, Mr. President, is our distinguished Deputy Minority Leader, no other than Senator Risa Ontiveros. I move that she be recognized, Mr. President.
Our Deputy Minority Leader, Senator Risa Ontiveros, is recognized.
Salamat po, Mr. President. Good gentleman from San Juan, good sponsor, mari po bang makapagtanong din dito sa ating panukala?
Gladly, Mr. President.
Thank you, good sponsor. Actually, bago yung mga nakahanda kong mga tanong, habang pinakikinggan ko po yung interpellation sa inyo ng ating good gentleman mula sa Cavite, at pinaalala po ninyong dalawa yung panukala 35 years ago na 125 pesos across the board wage increase. O basta yung, kung namali po ako sa ilang taon po ba yun na nakaraan na. Pero yung panukala noon, kaya't naisip ko, mula dun sa original na panukala ninyo, good sponsor na 150 pesos, papunta dito sa ating tinatalakay na 100 pesos, ano kaya, ba't hindi naging 125 na lamang muli tulad noon?
No, ngayon po ang pinapanukuala po natin ay 100 pesos lamang po,
Opo.
hindi po 125.
Oh,
Yung
noon
125 po, nagbuslo po yan nung nakapagpasa po ang House of Representatives ng isang batas na legislated wage hike na 125 across the
Opo.
board.
Opo.
At wala pa ho kayo rito, hindi pa ho
Opo.
kayo senador noon at
Opo.
nandito na po ako noon.
Opo.
At nung na-refer po sa aking committee, ang Committee on Labor, agad-agad po ay nagsagawa tayo ng hearing para maipasa po itong 125 across the board.
Opo.
Katulad nga ng sinabi ko kanina kay Senator Revilla, nung naipasa po ng Senado ang 125 across the board, ay winidraw naman po ng
Yun na
ibang
nga po.
miyembro ng House of Representatives ang kanilang sariling batas, ang sariling panukala na sila mismo ang nag-aproba.
Opo.
Kaya hindi po natuloy ang 125 peso across the board wage increase.
Sayang
Di ba
po talaga good sponsor at mahiwaga.
Mahiwaga
Kaya
nga
naisip
po,
ko rin
dahil-
nga, ba't hindi na lang natin inulit yung proseso ngayon at baka magtagumpay ngayon?
Well, sana po kung maipasa po natin itong panukalang batas nito at maibalik sa House of Representatives, sana po ay gawan nila na aksyon. Dahil nakita naman natin ang patuloy na pagtaas ng bilihin at katulad nga ng sinabi ko kanina, yung 610 pesos na tinatanggap ng ating mga manggagawa dito sa Kalakhang, Maynila ay 504 pesos na lang ang purchasing
Sa totoo.
power.
Opo. Kaya nga po, itinanong ko, bakit hindi na lang ang ating panukala ay 125?
Okay.
Sa halip
Kasi
na
po,
100 good sponsor.
originally, Mr. President, ang aking panukalang batas ay 150.
Ayun na nga po.
Alright? Tapos, nagtaas po ang Regional Wage Board ng 40 pesos
Opo.
dito sa Metro Manila. So, naging, from 570, naging 610 pesos. Kaya kung if I will stick to 150, baka marami ng mga magsasarang business establishments. Kaya po, binabaan po natin na 100 pesos para tugma pa rin dun sa 150 na original na pinapanukala po natin.
I see. Sige po, good sponsor. Iwan ko na muna doon sa ngayon yung isyong ito dahil tulad din ng tinutukoy nyo na yung minimum wage ang totoong purchasing power ay mas mababa, hindi naman siguro sana magrereklamo yung mga manggagawa natin sa dagdag 25 pesos wage hike sana, yung pagitan ng kasalukuyang 100 at yung itinatanong ko lang naman na 125 muli. So,
Ito pong, kaya naman din po umabot sa 100 pesos, this is also based from the consultations made by the different stakeholders concerned, Mr. President.
I understand, good sponsor. And as I promised, I'll leave that question here for now. Anyway po, matagal pa po yung ating pinagkakaisang mga advokasya dito sa Senado, papunta halimbawa sa isang living wage para sa mga manggagawa na magiging sustainable din sa iba pang stakeholders sa ating ekonomiya. So anyway po, good sponsor. Paano po tutugon yung sponsor sa hiling ng labor na rebisahin natin yung Regional Tripartite Wages and Productivity Boards sa ilalim ng RA 6727. I-review daw po natin yung regional wage boards na yan kasunod ng inaasahan din po nilang pag-aproba nitong ating 100 pesos wage hike bill.
Well, according to my staff, there are several proposed bills that we can hear, and probably we can get the inputs of the stakeholders concerned, Mr. President, in the appropriate time, Mr. President.
Salamat,
At the
good
appropriate
sponsor,
time.
at naglulook forward din po ako dyan. Ngayon po, in the Philippines, wages can be increased through three primary mechanisms. Legislative action, tulad ng ginagawa natin ngayon, yung regional wage boards nga po na wage orders nila, at saka collective bargaining agreements. Apart from these, there's also the possibility of employers themselves voluntarily raising wages on their own initiative in the exercise of management prerogative, which, however, is not a common practice. So,
Mr.
Yes, good
President,
sponsor.
if I may ask,
Opo.
do you know of any business establishments who volunteered to increase the salaries of their respective workers, Mr.
siguro
President?
po,
I have
good
heard of
sponsor,
nothing, Mr. President.
kaunti lamang o maliliit lamang, kaya po't hindi na ibabalita. So, kaya ang literature lamang po ay it's not a common practice.
Yes,
So it's a
yes,
rare practice. Maybe,
I agree, Mr.
Opo,
President.
Maybe so rare na we don't often hear about it. So now, with these current discussions, or with current discussions surrounding the regional wage board's role following the 100 peso wage hike bill, questions arise. Halimbawa po, kino-consider ba nating bawiin yung authority ng mga regional wage boards mag-issue ng wage orders? At in fact, may contemplation ba tayo ng isang alternatibong wage system na maaring pumalit sa regional wage boards?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Mr. President, maybe we can thoroughly review all the proposed bills that are pending before this committee with regard to the wage regional wage boards, Mr. President.
Salamat, good sponsor. At siguro, once we start deliberating on those bills, bukod sa posibleng pagbabago sa mandates ng regional wage boards, papasok na rin yung posibilidad ng alternative
Yes.
wage systems. Kasama na yung kaugnay ng yung konsepto ng living wage.
I agree, Mr. President.
Salamat, good sponsor. Now, Section 3 of our bill states that, quote, the minimum wage rate of all workers in the private sector, whether agricultural or non-agricultural, shall be increased by 100 pesos a day upon the effectivity of this act. Ito po ba, good sponsor, ay magiging across the board para maiwasan yung wage distortion?
Yes, this is across the board, but it only applies to minimum wage earners only, Mr. President.
Okay po. Malinaw po 'yon. And ano po yung magiging base ng 100 pesos per day increase? Mula ba sa halaga ng wage board order sa bawat rehiyon?
Ano? You are correct, Mr. President.
Alright, salamat, good sponsor. At ito, sabi nyo nga po, good sponsor, only for minimum wage earners. So, ibig bang sabihin, hindi po covered yung managerial
No.
employees?
It is
No.
not covered, Mr. President.
Alright. Ngayon, ito po bang measure, i-cover din yung mga micro-enterprises?
Yes. Micro. If it is less than 10, I don't think so, Mr. President.
Okay. So kung less than 10, kung micro-enterprises na less than 10 employees, hindi mako-cover nito, paano naman po yung mga manggagawa sa mga micro-enterprises na yan?
If there are... Mr. President, as a general rule, kasama po ang micro-enterprises. But if they have a certification from DTI, no? DTI? From the Department of Trade and Industry as a barangay micro enterprise,
Opo.
uh, I think they can be they are not covered, no? They are not covered. I think they are not covered, Mr. President.
Okay. Kung meron nga silang certification, DTI certification bilang barangay micro-enterprise at less than 10 employees po sila, itong mga micro-enterprises na ito. So, paano na nga po itong mga empleyado nila na hindi makikinabang dito sa ating 100 peso wage hike bill?
Sabihin mo, yung micro-enterprises, pag require minimum
Mr. President, sandali lang po.
Session suspended.
Mr. President, with regard to the question of our colleague, Senator Risa, Mr. President, there are only, according to the representatives from the Department of Labor who are present right here today, there are only 56,000 BMB establishments all over the country. And we have the BMB law, RA 9178, that exempts them from the coverage of the minimum wage law, Mr. President. And because of the minimal capitalization of only 3 million pesos, I think they are exempted from the minimum wage law, Mr. President.
I understand that would sponsor. Ang mahirap lamang ay 90% of formal labor actually are in micro-enterprises. So kung exempted sila or magiging exempt sila dito sa ating 100 peso wage hike bill, ibig sabihin 10% lang ng formal labor ay makikinabang dito. I'm not saying na sitwasyon ito na imposibleng ma-resolve kasi may kasabay naman akong tanong na kung maisasama pati yung mga empleyado sa micro-enterprises, which actually are, yun na nga, 90% of formal labor, dapat pa rin nating itanong, may mga paraan bang i-mitigate yung impact dun sa micro-enterprises? Considering yung micro-enterprises din lang ang dumami or tumaas ang bilang nung pandemic, so may ipinakita silang resilience. At syempre, kailangan din naman nating pangalagaan ng interes ng mga maliliit na entrepreneurs. Good sponsor.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. I agree with you, Mr. President. But siguro at the appropriate time, maybe we can welcome any proposed amendments coming from Your Honor, Mr. President, with regard to the BMBE law, Mr. President.
Salamat, good sponsor. So based on that agreement of the good sponsor that 90% of formal labor are in micro-enterprises at yung agreement din nila na kailangan din nga nating pangalagaan ang interes ng mga maliliit na entrepreneur, then I look forward to at the proper time proposing amendments para sa konsiderasyon ng good sponsor. Maraming salamat
Thank
po
you,
sa
Mr.
inyo.
President.
Salamat, Mr. President.
Thank you, our Deputy Minority Leader. Majority Leader.
Yes, Mr. President. Mr. President, next to interpolate is the distinguished gentleman from the city of Valenzuela, the chairperson of the Senate Committee on Basic Education, no other than Senator Sherwin Gatchalian. I move that he be recognized, Mr. President.
Senator Sherwin Gatchalian is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, still good sponsor willing to just take a few questions, Mr. President.
Gladly, Mr. President.
Well, Mr. President, from the onset, let me commend the good sponsor for taking the plight of our minimum wage earners. This has been a long discussion, and finally it has hit the floor, giving our minimum wage earners some hope in terms of bringing home bigger income for their families. When this was sponsored, I think a few days on the floor, there were a lot of news reports, especially from different business agencies or business organizations that came out with statements that are concerning to this representation and also quite concerning to the business sector. So I just want to clarify and get the opinion of the good sponsor on certain issues. Number one on that news report is the topic of inflation. And in that news report that I read, and this is common to many of the economists and also common sense knowledge to businessmen, that if you increase salaries and wages, the tendency is they might increase the prices of products. And in turn, that will be sold to our consumers. And it goes on, no, as a domino effect. So the fear of many of our constituents or of our the fear of many, it might spur another round of inflation. And considering that the last month, inflation has gone down to about 2%, and that's a 3-year low, which has been a very difficult feat to achieve, considering there's war, there's effects of El Nino. But this bill or this proposal might spur another round of inflation. So I want to get the opinion of our good sponsor, and from the hearings that he conducted, what are the simulations or report as to the effects to inflation?
Thank you, Mr. President. I was really expecting those kinds of questions coming from my colleagues. Mr. President, this is a really contentious issue, Mr. President, and we cannot deny that probably there might be some sort of inflationary impact with regard to the goods or services of enterprises. Dahil posibleng babawin naman ng mga negosyante ang mandatong taas sahod sa kanilang consumers, Mr. President. And on the other hand, Mr. President, higher wages would also mean putting money in the pockets of workers and more purchasing power for the regular Filipino worker. Ibig sabihin po, mas maraming siyang mabibili sa kanyang sinasahod, which would mean more economic activity and effectively redound to the domestic economy. Sa katunayan, Ginoong Pangulo, Mr. President, ang monthly poverty threshold para sa ilang miyembro ng pamilya ay 13,797. Itong 2023, first semester ng 2023, ayon sa statistics sa PSA, o Philippine Statistics Authority, tumas ito mula 10,532 noong 2018 at 12,082 noong 2021. Halimbawa, ang pinakamataas na sahod na 610 pesos mula sa NCR ay makakatanggap naman ng 14,640 pesos kada buwan. Mas mataas lamang ito ng konti sa poverty threshold. Sabayan pa ng pambaon ng mga anak, pamasahe, pang-araw-araw na pagkain, kuryente, bigas, pambayad sa tubig, pang-load ng cellphone, at iba pang mga gastusin, Mr. President. Kung head of the family siya, kung head of the family siya, at siya lang ang mag-isang maghanap buhay para sa kanyang pamilya, ano lang po matitira sa kanya, Mr. President? Paano naman po ay ibang rehiyon na mas mababa ang sahod at kapantay lang ng sa syudad o mas mahal na naman ang mga presyo ng mga bilihin, Ginoong Pangulo? In fact, a total of 144 pesos increase for different wage orders po, Mr. President. In NCR, minimum wage was recorded from 2016 to 2023 in a span of 7 long years, Mr. President. Based on the 40 pesos increase that was granted to Metro Manila or the NCR last year, the lead economist, itong si Emilio Neri Jr., had said that higher minimum wages would lead to a bump in inflation since it only covers a narrow portion of the labor sector. Mr. President, when workers are faced with increasing prices, they begin to lobby automatically, they begin to lobby for higher wages to compensate for the decline in their purchasing capacity, as what the regional wage boards did last year. But the real value of the minimum wage, which reflects the inflation-adjusted rates using the consumer price index, has fallen to 514 pesos and 50 centavos, which I mentioned earlier during the interpellation by Senator Bong Revilla. And so based on these facts, Mr. President, and data, wage increase will not result to faster inflation, Mr. President. And that is all I can say, Mr. President.
Thank you.
I think the Senate President has some more inputs,
Mr. President, if I may be allowed.
Yes,
the
as our President is recognized.
Yes, principal sponsor and co-sponsor of the measure together with Senator Jingo Estrada, who's the sponsor. Just to add to the conversation to my dear colleague from Valenzuela, remember we passed the train law about maybe 3 years or 4 years ago.
4 years ago.
2018. 2018, about 5 years ago. Under the train law, meron tayong hakbang na binabaan po natin yung income tax, ng corporate income tax ng ating
That's in
mga... CREATE pala yun, CREATE law. I stand corrected. Nung pinasa po natin yung CREATE law, binaba po natin ang minimum, corporate income tax from 33% to 25%. 8% po ang kinaltas sa corporate income tax. Kaya pag kinausap nyo, this is pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, not during the pandemic, maraming negosyo ang natamaan sa pandemic. But after the pandemic, yung post-pandemic, ang ganda po ng recovery ng mga negosyante. Sa totoo lang po, araw-araw napapanood natin end of the year reports nung before Christmas, and they were showing fourth quarter phenomenal incomes, Ayala, SM, SMC, na talagang they're 20% of higher in income for this year, yung iba 50% income, record-breaking incomes. So, yung record-breaking income na yan, mga kapatid, no, Mr. President, is due to the fact na may ginawa po tayong hakbang na nakatulong po sa mga kumpanya, which is binabaan po natin ng corporate income tax. And I clearly recall that during the debates, gusto din iangat ng Department of Finance Yung dividends tax, gusto po yata gawin nun at, if I'm not mistaken, well, you're now the chairman of the Committee on Ways and Means, they were trying to increase it to 20%. And then nag-ano sila, they appealed to 15%. Here in the Senate, we did not agree. We left it at 10% dividends tax. Para sa ganun, meron ding magandang income yung mga may-ari ng mga kumpanyang ito in terms of dividendo sa kanilang mga negosyo. Kaya siguro naman it's time to also look into the possibility of increasing the minimum wages to decent wages ang kanilang manggagawa because makakatulong talaga ito in terms of productivity, in terms of spending back to the economy, in terms of being able to survive their everyday lives, Your Honor. So, I do beg to disagree with due respect to the ECOP and the PCCI. If you look at all their data, napakaganda na po ng income nila dahil sa ginawa natin mga hakbang sa crate. Kaya ang hiling po natin sana ay dito naman po sila sa ating mga manggagawa mag-focus. Di sa pagyayabang po, Mr. President, I'm in the ice business and the power business. I have ice plants, industrial ice plants. Whatever the minimum wage is, I add 30 pesos, 20 to 30 pesos, over and above, para makatulong sa kanila. I do it on my own, and we do not do, so all my workers do not earn just minimum wage, they earn over and above. And this year, we were able to give 15-month bonus, 13-month bonus, 13-month, which is by law, plus 2 months bonus. And the productivity of the sales force in our business has really tremendously increased. Talagang highly motivated sila. They're very loyal to the company. So, in a way, nakakatulong talaga yung pagbigay natin ng konting dagdag sa sahod sa kanila. And sabi ko nga, itong inangat ng wage boards recently, hindi nga sapat, Your Honor, Mr. President, my dear colleagues, para sa 1 kilong bigas. Yung 40 pesos, hindi pa sapat yan para sa 1 kilong bigas sa kanilang mga pamilya. Pang araw-araw pong kain nila po ng at least for dinner and for breakfast and lunch for their children. Kaya, if inflation is to be a measure also, I don't think that it is going to be too much. It will increase inflation in our country because, we have some historical data and study which says past minimum wage increases have found little to no evidence that they cause significant inflation. This suggests that the market can absorb the wage increases without a substantial effect on price levels. And then again, if we're looking at incomes of companies, I repeat and reiterate, the stand of the Senate in helping make sure that we brought down the corporate income tax to be able to help these companies achieve very good income status every end of the year. So, thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, my dear
Thank you,
colleagues.
Mr. President. And in fact, Mr. President, for MSMEs, we lowered down from 30% to all the way to 20%, Mr. President. So for big companies, it's 25% CIT. For MSMEs, it's 20% CIT, Mr. President. So thank you very much for that intervention, Senate President. And I thank the good sponsor for assuring the public that the inflationary effect might not be significant or there is no inflationary effect on this proposal. May I just ask for me, Mr. President, I think the best simulation is a historical perspective. Meaning, let's look at the past increases in terms of wages, minimum wages. And may I ask the good sponsor, in the past, what is the biggest increase in terms of minimum wage? And was there any inflationary effect when that increased?
Ako na yung data. Just a minute, Mr. President. I'd like to collect the data.
Session suspended.
President, according to the representatives from the Department of Labor, the biggest increase in minimum wage is 110 pesos in Region 6. That means Region 6 sa Negros? That was in 2022, Mr. President. And there was an effect in the region, but has a very, very minimal effect in the national figures, Mr. President, in our economy. Very, very little effect. It was very minimal, Mr.
Yeah,
President.
so, Mr. President, I think that is the best example that an increase in minimum wage does not necessarily mean increase in prices of products that
Correct.
translates to inflation, especially if there's only one region, because you can bring in other products from other regions that can mitigate the inflationary effect of wage increases.
I agree, Mr. President.
And Mr. President, I was looking at the wage increase. A lot of it came in 2023, no? If my
2023.
information is correct.
Yes,
And in
you are correct.
2023, the talk about inflation revolves around energy, food prices, and transportation, Mr. President. I don't recall reading anything about inflation due to increase in minimum wage, Mr. President. So again, that's another example, Mr. President, that it doesn't necessarily mean that an increase in minimum wage will translate into inflation. No?
Yes, Mr. President.
Because looking at the historical increases, we did not see any significant change in terms of prices of goods. So that's the a point that I want to make, Mr. President. And maybe later on, we would like to also request from the good sponsor through Dole and the other experts to study this angle and furnish this representation, that angle of historical experiences.
Yes, Mr. President. We will comply with the request of
Thank
the
you,
good
Mr.
gentleman
President.
from
Mr.
Valenzuela.
President, another topic that I read in the internet is competitiveness of our country in terms of labor cost. And may I ask the good sponsor, just here in ASEAN, the 11 countries in ASEAN, how are we faring in terms of labor cost?
I think, Bing, SP, meron kang data? Yun sa ibang countries.
Mr. President.
Okay, Mr. President, I think I have it here, Mr. President, with all due respect to the Senate President.
Okay.
In Myanmar, I think, in Myanmar, Mr. President, the, in dollars, no? Ang tinatanggap nila ay 69 point, okay. Daily minimum wage for non-agricultural is $2.31 in Myanmar. Ano ba ito? And in Laos, Laos ba ito? Lao. Ano yung PDL? People's Democratic Republic. They receive $2.11. In Bangladesh, $2.49 a day. In Pakistan, $3. Mongolia, $7. Cambodia, $6.7. Vietnam, $6.39. Thailand, $10. Indonesia, $10.35. Malaysia, 12.21. China, 12.16. Taiwan, 27.03. Hong Kong, 38.39. South Korea, 57.89. Japan, 56.47. New Zealand, 111.37. Australia, 122.71. Philippines, 10.83 in NCR. Region 11, 7.86. Region 4A, 9.23. Region 7, 8.31. And Region 3, 8.87, Mr. President.
Mr. President, may I just I just want to find out if our figures are the same because we already updated our figures for Malaysia, Malaysia is now $13.8.
Daily?
That's
Is this
about
daily minimum
wage,
wage? All right.
758 pesos. Jakarta is 724. They just increased the minimum wage. 724 pesos ang Indonesia. And Singapore, they do not have a daily wage. They have a minimum monthly wage. It's about 32,000 pesos. So if you divide it by close to 1,000 pesos a day, or more, no? About 1,200 pesos a day yung Singapore. Even Taiwan just recently did a minimum wage increase. It came out all over the news. Taiwan increased their
In dollars, how much?
26, magkano?
Right now it's
$26.95 a day in Taiwan. So
right now
that's-
it's 27.03, Mr.
27,
President.
okay.
Yeah.
I stand corrected, 27 pesos.
As
So-
of January 31, 2024.
And then I was told by Vietnam, the Vietnamese ambassador, they're also going to do because of the rise in industries, because of their phenomenal growth rate and being the darling of investors, the labor force now is uneasy, and they're asking also for a increase in minimum wage. So they're looking at increasing also the minimum wage. Right now, they're about 500, I think 520 pesos. But ang difference sa kanila, Your Honors, wala silang kaltas. Being a communist country, wala silang PhilHealth kaltas. Wala silang mga taxes. Kasi libre yata. Yung pag-ibig, wala din sila. Kasi yung pabahay nila dun, libre. Yung hospital nila dun, libre. So technically, kung tinanggalan natin yung mga kaltas ng ating mga minimum wage earners, it's not a big difference from Vietnam. So mas maganda nga na mataas-taas pa rin natin itaas pa ng konti.
So, Mr. President, the question of our colleague, Senator Gatchalian, in terms of wages, I think the Philippines is competitive, but I think there's still a lot of room for improvement, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, may I ask the good sponsor, how much is the Philippines,
Wage?
yes, the current minimum wage of the Philippines?
In NCR, it's 610, Mr. President. In, ano ito?
I have, if you wish, I can
Oh.
share the information, Your Honor.
Ano ito? Saan ito? Ano ito?
With the permission of the sponsor,
No, no.
I have the list.
NCR, 610 from 573. In CAR, Cordillera,
430.
430.
Yes.
In Region, ano to? Region 1? Region 4,
Region 1.
Region 1 from 402, increase it to 435. Region 2, increase of 30 pesos from 400, ano? O ba't mali? 430 to 450, siguro 422 to 450. Tapos ano region to? Region 3?
500, Region 3.
Region 3, naging 40 pesos increase, naging 500 pesos. Region 4A,
Yata,
520. Region 4, Mimaropa, from 369, naging 395.
Your Honor, Mr. President, may I just correct the good gentleman? I believe there's two columns. The lower column is not where it came from. Is that the agricultural sector? Kasi iba yung agriculture sector, iba yung non-agricultural sector. Mas mababa yun ang agricultural sector. So on the list that I have here, maybe Dole can just, and the sponsor can correct me. For Region 1, it's 402 for agricultural workers, 435 for non-agri. For Region 2, it's 430 for agricultural workers, 450 for non-agri. For Region 3, it's 384 for agriculture, and for non-agri is 500. For Region 4, it's 385 for agricultural employees and 520 for non-agricultural. For
Okay.
Region 4B,
Tama siya.
it's
369.
369, yes, for agricultural, and 395 for non-agricultural. Pero ang bababa, Mr. President, and you can see 395 pesos. Sa Region 5, it's 395 pesos all over the region.
Region
Baba.
6, we have 440 for
Non-agricultural.
non-agriculture.
Agricultural, sorry.
And agricultural, and 480 for non-agricultural. And Region 7, 415 for agricultural, and 468 for non-agricultural. Region 8, 375 for agricultural, and 405 for non-agricultural. Region 9, 368 pesos for non-agricultural, and 381 for agricultural. For non-agricultural. Region 10, 411 for agricultural, and 438 for non-agricultural. Region 11, 438 pesos for agricultural, and 443 pesos for non-agricultural. And Region 12, 382 for agricultural, and 403 for non-agricultural. Region 13, 370 for agricultural, and 385 for non-agricultural. And BARM, 306 for agricultural, and 341 for non-agricultural, Mr. President. So napakababa talaga nitong mga tinatanggap nilang sahod, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, Mr. President, that's the beauty about our wage structure. It has different wages in different regions. That means it's in line with the supply and demand in that particular region, as well as the living conditions in that particular region. And Mr. Chairman, Mr. Good Sponsor, Your Honor, this is also a way to disperse development outside of Metro Manila. Because I heard our Senate President mentioned earlier that Vietnam's minimum wage is 520 pesos equivalent. No? If you compare this to, let's say, Region 3, Region 3 is even lower at 500 pesos. For Region 4A, it's about the same, 520. So in other words, if you talk about competitiveness, we can actually use the adjacent areas to be competitive. And that's what we want, no? To disperse development outside of Metro Manila, because in the goal of attracting investors, we don't want them to invest in Metro Manila all the time. We want them to invest in Region 3, in Region 4A, so that growth will be dispersed. We will create employment outside of Metro Manila. And if you look at the wages in those areas, they're very competitive. No? Of course, if you look at if you just look at Metro Manila, it might not be competitive because this is the growth center. No? The demand here is very high. But if you look at Region 3, Region 4A, and the other regions, they're very, very competitive. And that's what we want, for those regions to take the bulk of the investments, for those regions to take the bulk of the factories that who wants to set up here in the Philippines. So, Mr. President, I think the competitiveness discussion should be looked at on what we want in terms of policy and in terms of even development. And I think for now, if you look at the other regions, they're very competitive. They're very competitive vis-a-vis the other ASEAN countries, Mr. President.
Yes, you are correct, Mr. President. And I think we are competitive as compared to the other countries. The other countries, unlike Bangladesh, Pakistan, which receives a much lower minimum wage, Mr. President. But as far as the other countries are concerned, like for example, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, and Australia, they receive not only double, but talagang malaki ang tinatanggap nilang daily minimum wage, Mr. President, as compared to our country.
Yes, Mr. President, those are very developed nations, and of course, labor, especially minimum wage labor. I mean, the minimum wage earners there are quite low in terms of numbers, Mr. President. But if you look at areas like Barm, areas like Caraga, or even in the Davao area or Mindanao area, Region 12, Region 11, they're very competitive. 390 pesos in Region 12, 443 pesos in Region 11. And that's where we want investors and factory owners to go, to those
Yes.
areas. Because equally, they have talented people, they have vast amount of land. In fact, their land there is much greater than Metro Manila and NCR. But of course, we also need to invest in infrastructure. No? That's the government side. But in terms of labor competitiveness, we can direct those investors towards the rural area so that development will be equal and dispersed, Mr. President. So that's
Agree
my
with you, Mr. President.
that's my take on the competitiveness angle, Mr. President. Another item that I read, and I think Senator Risa already expounded on this, is the impact to MSMEs. Because I read in the article in the internet that MSMEs will bear the brunt of this proposal because MSMEs obviously hire minimum wage earners, and Senator Risa mentioned earlier they're about 98, 99, no? 90%, no? About 98, 99% of our businesses. And a lot of these MSMEs hire minimum wage earners because their capital is low, because their businesses are small, and their turnover or their revenue is also quite small. So my first question, Mr. President, is how many minimum wage earners are there in the Philippines?
Approximately 4.2 million, Mr. President.
And do we have data on how many of them work in MSMEs?
Unfortunately, Mr. President, we do not have any data.
Yeah. Maybe we can ask the help of Dole later on to just submit to this representation and to the committee that data. Because we want to know, just on common sense, no? I think MSMEs hire minimum wage earners. But we want to make sure that in that 4.2 million number, how many of them work in MSMEs, how many of them work in large corporations, so that we will understand the employment pattern of these 4.2 million individuals, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I think we can obtain a copy at the Philippine Statistics Authority, Mr. President, because unfortunately the Department of Labor does not have a data with regard to how many are employed as in the MSMEs, Mr. President.
But Mr. President, I would like to ask the good sponsor his opinion on
Ito?
the impact to MSMEs. And based on the hearings and also his expert knowledge on the matter, is there any concern or any reason that this proposal might have an adverse impact to our MSMEs?
Before I answer your question, I think I have a data here with regard to the full-time wage and salary workers in tama ba ito? Private establishments receiving exactly the minimum wage by region, Mr. President. If I may, in Philippines, you were asking that ilan yung minimum wage earners. Ang sagot ko po sa inyo, around 4.1 to 4.2 million. And the breakdown is as follows. In the NCR, we have 988,000. In Cordillera, 10,000. Region 1, approximately 170,000. Region 2, 64,000. Region 3, 736,000. Region 4A, 882,000. Region 4B, 64,000. Region 5, 27,000. Region 6, 193,000. Region 7, 364,000. Region 8, 126,000. Region 9, 95,000. Region 10, 144,000. Region 11, 132,000. Region 12, 103,000. Caraga Region, 65,000. And Barm, approximately 1,064, Mr. President. And if we want to have a hard copy, I will be willing to submit a hard copy to your office.
So, Mr. President, I would like to get the opinion of the good sponsor as to how this proposal will have an impact to MSMEs. Based on his expert knowledge, what do you think will be the impact to the MSMEs?
If I may, Mr. President, with the permission of Senator
Yes,
Jinggoy,
Mr. President.
I believe for the micro, walang impact, sir, because the micro is exempted. So employ less than 10 workers, they're exempted from the minimum wage increase, I believe, under the bill of Senator Jinggoy. So yung small and
Micro is exempted.
is the existing law. In the existing law pala, Your Honor. In the existing law, minimum wage law. So,
That means, Mr. Senate President, the micro businesses are exempted from implementing this
those
particular.
with less than 10 employees.
Those with less than 10 employees.
Yes, I think I've already answered that during the interpellation
Earlier.
made by Senator Risa, Mr.
yeah.
President.
So it's a small naman po. Kasi like my business, my ice plants are considered medium. So, kaya naman. They can absorb it, Your Honor. They can absorb it. Kasi if you have about 40 employees, the increase on that is so minimum, it's not really felt as a big impact. As a matter of fact, I have here, Your Honor, for the record, on a larger company that employs 1,000 people, 1,000 minimum wage earners, at 22 days a month, Your Honor, you're only looking at 26.4 million per year additional cost for the company with 1,000 minimum wage earner employees. So I don't think that's why I really feel that it wouldn't be inflationary in terms of the effects on rather small and medium enterprise.
Maybe a minimal effect, Mr. President.
Minimal effect.
Will it, I think the bottom line, Mr. President, for many entrepreneurs is, especially MSMEs, will it diminish their profit margin? Will they lose money? I think in terms of absorption, I think they can absorb probably, depending on the business. But will they lose money because of increasing the minimum wage by 100 pesos? So I think that's bottom line. Everyone is into business because they want to make money, they want to have profit, and of course expand their businesses. But will this proposal affect their profit margin and even bring them to the red, Mr. President?
Well, if I may answer that, because I'm a small business operator, I believe not, because of the 25% income taxes that we granted them through the CREATE law. So that's an 8% spread of income, Your Honors. If we were still in the regime of 33%, then maybe we'll be more hesitant about passing this minimum wage increase. But since we gave them an 8% discount for their income taxes, and for small and medium enterprises, it's 20%. Mas mababa pa, Your
correct,
Honors.
Mr. President.
So we gave them a 13% spread. That's correct. You're absolutely correct, Your Honor. We gave them a 13% spread of income. So kaya na nilang ma-absorb sigurado yun, Your Honor, Mr.
Yeah.
President.
Well, Mr. President, I also did some simulation on our own, looking at the average profit margins of small and medium enterprises. Micro, Mr. President, you said it's exempted. And you're absolutely correct, because of that reduction in CIT by about 13%. Their profit margin remains to be in the double-digit figures. No? For example, even if we increase it by 100 pesos, their profit margin for small enterprises is about 13.15%. No? So it's a decent profit margin. For medium enterprises, about 14.69%. So again, a decent profit. Anything double-digit for I'm sure the good Senate President knows this. Anything double-digit is already good.
Very good.
No, you're already above the savings rate or even long-term rate, Mr. President. So, in other words, it might diminish a little bit, but they're still earning decently, Mr. President, with the proposal on hand, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, I think the MSMEs will probably enjoy highly motivated workers because at the end of the day, they have enough income to bring to their families, to buy medicines, and when they're healthy, they can go to work and be more productive, Mr. President. And without actually diminishing the profit of our small, medium enterprises, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, that's basically, those are the topics that I saw in the internet that came out, I think, on Monday. And again, I thank the good sponsor for spearheading this important legislation. And I was actually surprised that in NCR, it took 10 years to increase a measly 40 pesos, Mr. President. And we all know last year, inflation was crazy. So I think, Mr. President, this proposal will definitely improve the lives of our constituents, especially the minimum wage earners, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I just stand corrected. In NCR, the last increase was, of course, last year, June 20, 2023, 40 pesos. And then May, June 2022, there was increase of 33 pesos.
No, 22.
2018, increase of 25 pesos. 2017, 31 pesos. And 2016, 25 pesos, Mr. President. So hindi po after 10 years.
Hindi po. I stand corrected, Mr. President. My data is not accurate on that respect, Mr. President. But Mr. President, again, I thank the good sponsor for spearheading this, and thank you very much for your time and for answering a few questions, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, if I may, I want to thank Senator Sherwin Gatchalian. He also is in the family of, they also have businesses. He runs hotels. He used to be, that's how I met him, as manager of the Waterfront Hotel in Cebu. Many, many eons ago when we were both very young and we were both, I was single then. But he knows the importance of a very robust, inspired workforce. Kasi he's in the hospitality business. So kung happy sila, talagang they will upsell your business, your hotels, your restaurants. And at the same time, Your Honors, I've had a chance to talk to people like DECGO, Sabina Boitis, even EKR, si Razon, SMC, all of them are in favor of increasing the rates. None of them, not one of them that I talked to, was against it because they felt they had the buffer, they had enough income to be able to support it. And that's about maybe 80% of the minimum wage earners, all the large corporations that we're talking about. And imagine the impact to the economy, Your Honor, Mr. President. When you give them an additional bonus like this on a daily basis, the impact on their lives, which eventually translate to the impact on the economy. Hindi naman po nila itatago ito lahat eh. Dadala po nila sa McDonald's, tsaka Jollibee yung mga anak nila. Madadala na po nila bakasyon sa ibang probinsya. So, the impact on their lives are tremendous, Your Honor. And I thank the good gentleman from Valenzuela. He knows this, being that Valenzuela probably has a huge amount of minimum wage earners that are toiling day in and day out. Maraming salamat po, sir.
But Mr. President, since the Senate President mentioned about large corporations, in our simulation, their profit margin is about 16.08%. So in other words, just if you put your money in an ordinary savings rate, you're only going to get, 2 to 3%, but they're earning 16%. So the buffer, you're absolutely correct, Mr. President, the buffer is there, no? So the 100 peso increase will be very minimal, but in exchange, you'll get highly motivated, employees who are dignified when they go in, and that's also an intangible that cannot be computed through numbers, Mr. President. So thank you, Mr. President.
Bless your heart, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Gatchalian.
Ito ka na, bro.
Senator Angara seeking the floor. Is recognized.
With the permission of the Majority Leader to borrow his rostrum. Will the distinguished gentleman, the chair of the Committee on Labor, I was his vice chair when I was a newbie senator. I know his heart is for the workers. Will he yield to very few questions?
Gladly,
President.
Mr. President.
Yeah.
I think I was the one who appointed you as my vice chair.
That's right, that's
The
right.
Committee on Labor when
Exactly.
I was vacationing in Camp Crame, Mr. President.
I owe that to you, Mr. President, for entrusting that responsibility. And I was thrust to a position of leadership thanks to the
Because
gentleman.
you are more capable, Mr.
And I
President.
thank him. No, that's not true. That's not true. Mr. President, I was listening intently, and I appreciate the interpellations of our colleagues, Senator Risa, Senator Win, especially on bringing out the issues on inflation, kasi yan talaga yung traditional issue. And I just want to state at the outset that I'm in favor of this measure, this very worthy measure filed by no less than our Senate President, no less than our Senate Committee Chair on Labor, Senator Bong Revilla, Senate President Pro Tem Legarda, Senator Binay, Senator Go, among others. No, I just want to, as they say, the devil is in the details. I just want to bring out, so that we have the best possible measure, Mr. President. Is there an issue on wage distortion, especially when it comes to taxes also, Mr. President? Would that ever happen? I can just place that on the record
President,
while we're waiting for the answer. I'll ask my next question.
Mr. President,
That's all
yes,
right, yeah.
there will be a wage distortion because those who are receiving more than the minimum wage will have to receive an increase as well, Mr. President.
Is that part of the bill, Your Honor?
No, Mr. President.
Okay. So there will be a case where the newly minted minimum wages will receive more than the others who are not going to receive any increase. I'm just wondering if there's an effect on, number one, tax collection. You don't have to answer that immediately because that's a very complicated subject. Because that happened before. I remember when we were talking about the train law, there was a case where if we increased or if we gave a tax benefit to the lowest wage earner, then there would be some kind of wage distortion. But I'm seeing that, for example, Mr. President, the lowest salary grade 1 in the government, receives around 156,000 per year. And under the bill, I'm told that non-agricultural employees will receive 187,000 and agricultural employees will receive 177,000 annually. So, ang mangyayari, yung minimum wagers will be paid more than the lowest paid permanent employee in government. So I'm wondering, what is the effect on the employee and also on the macroeconomy? Will that cause employees to prefer to be minimum wagers rather than aspire to have a permanent position?
With the permission of Senator Jinggoy, if I may.
All right.
Okay. On the issue, yes, there'll be a slight wage distortion, but if you ask me personally, Your Honor, Mr. President, I think they should be given increases as well. Because that will be the, how would you say, that will be the domino effect. Because then those earning a monthly salary, they're earning monthly. So they're going to be earning maybe 15,000. With this increase of 7, let's say right now it's 610 in Metro Manila, it'll become 710 pesos. If you multiply that, medyo malapit-lapit na po sila sa monthly earners. So, if you ask me, why should they also be stagnant in their wage? So if the company can also provide slightly increase for them, of course, I'm sure they will bargain for a slight increase, then they also deserve that additional income. That's my only, I don't have the figures, the numbers, but if you ask me, Mr. President, there's a procedure if, here, under the Article 124 of the Labor Code, under letter C, number 2, C, if there is no settlement, the distortion may be resolved through a labor arbiter or may be submitted by both parties for voluntary arbitration. So there's a process already where they can make the adjustments
Okay.
under the.
That's good to know. And the Senate President's response shows his heart is truly for the workers and the working class, Mr. President. I appreciate that.
Thank you, sir.
So I just want to place that on the table as something for possible study later on when this chairman is finalizing the bill, because I've heard it raised in public. So I think we would be remiss if we did not raise that, along with the question of inflation. And also, Senator Wynn earlier raised the issue of the informal sector. I thought, is it true the coverage is 4.2 million? I think that was your answer earlier.
Yes.
For this measure.
4.1 to
Yeah.
4.2 million minimum wage earners, Mr. President.
I'm just wondering, the argument, the counter-argument is always the informal sector. Incidentally, how big is the informal sector in the Philippines? Is it 15 million? That's the answer provided by Google, Mr. President. But perhaps we have a better answer.
Ballpark figure. Give me a ballpark figure.
Around 15 million, is that correct?
Only? Informal sectors? Informal. Ilan? 4.7 lang? Million? Well, Mr. President, according to the representatives from the Department of Labor, there are only 4.7. PSA, the Philippine Statistics Authority, Mr. President, 4.7 million informal members of the informal sector, Mr. President.
4 million?
4.7?
Yeah.
4.7, according to PSA, Mr. President.
How big is the workforce, the labor workforce? The labor force. We have a labor force survey every year. How big is that figure?
50.52 million, Mr. President.
So, I find it hard to believe.
Toto.
What is the labor participation rate? About 75%, no? So what is the total workforce if the informal sector is only 4 million? I can't reconcile that with the answer because our conventional wisdom is mas malaki talaga yung informal sector sa Pilipinas, di ba? Parang it's 33% or 1/3 of the economy.
50 million yung...
Ba't malit yung...
Mr. President, I think the PSA hasn't updated their data, Mr. President.
Anyway, they can just forward the answer when
Yes.
they.
Yes,
But
Mr.
I was just looking for a ballpark figure.
We will just
and
confirm, Mr. President.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for the sake of argument, the argument is that it is informal sector who will bear the brunt of the wage hike because, as some have perhaps correctly pointed out, pagtaas nung sahod, itataas din ng mga negosyante yung presyo nung kanila. Okay yun sa mga nataas yung sahod nila dahil may pambili sila. Pero yung mga hindi nataas yung sahod, which is the sector I'm trying to advert to, whether it's 4 million or 15 million, sila yung walang ano. So my question is, perhaps let's not forget that sector kasi siguro, I know the government has really increased yung kanyang pro-poor programs over the years. You've been a big supporter, yung AIX, TUPAD, etc. The DOLE has grown. Pero paano nga yung informal sector na, I believe, although we're waiting for the stats, mas malaki yon sa minimum wage earners, Mr. President.
Before I answer your question, the PSA representative informed me that there are 17.8 million informal workers, Mr. President.
What's the source of that information? Is it
From the labor force, Mr.
Okay.
President.
Yeah, I was thinking it's more in the 3 That's why the earlier response of 4 million came as a surprise,
Yes, Mr.
Mr.
President.
President.
I do,
But yun nga, so that's the argument. And if it's true, is it, paano yung 17 million na yun? Yun yung sasagot dun sa pagtaas ng presyo that it inevitably will be passed on by the businessmen or employers to the consuming public, Mr. President. So yun lang, I just want to place that on record. I don't want to belabor the issue. I know the leadership is pursuing this measure very assiduously. Yun lang, gusto ko lang sabihin na mag-ingat tayo dyan. Maybe maybe consider during the BICAM, maybe there's a way of softening the impact for this sector.
Well, Mr. President, the
Yeah.
increase in minimum wage will benefit not only those in the in the formal sector, but also those in the informal sector, Mr. President. I think it serves as a benchmark for informal workers on what is socially acceptable pay for their work, Mr. President.
It sounds good, Mr. President. Hindi ko masyado naintindihan sa totoo lang. But thank you very much. I'm just thinking of, yung pag nagtaas kasi ng presyo ng ang isang grocery, for instance, paano yung nagbebenta ng fishball, di ba? Yun, malamang hindi naman aabot siguro sa 500 piso yung inuuwi niya kada araw, di ba? Yung mga street vendors, these are the informal sector that we're adverting to. And I know, I trust your heart is in the right place, the heart of the leadership is in the right place. It's that we have to think of these things when we finalize the measure. Thank you, Mr.
Yes,
President.
thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Angara, Majority Leader.
Yes, Mr. President, may I be allowed to just ask some clarificatory questions, Mr. President, as I was listening attentively to the interpellations of our dear colleagues. I thought it would be helpful for this representation to join the discussion, considering that this is also one of our pet bills. Would the distinguished gentleman from San Juan, the sponsor of the measure, yield for some questions, very few questions, Mr. President?
Gladly, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President, siguro yung una pong itatanong ko ay yung mga tinatawag na fears, bakit ginagawa daw ng Senado itong pagtataas ng 100 pisong daily minimum wage, no? At ang sinasabi po nila, ang unang takot ay yung may posibilidad ba na ang pagtaas ng minimum wage ay magiging dahilan ng pagkakaroon, Ginoong Pangulo, pagkakaroon ng tinatawag na wage price spirals. Sususugan ko yung binanggit ni Senator Angara kanina. So kung tumaas yung sweldo, tataas din yung cost of production. So most likely, tataas yung presyo ng bilihin and therefore magkakaroon daw, at ito yung panakot lagi na naririnig natin, magkakaroon ng mabigat na inflation ang ating bayan. May we know, Mr. President, distinguished colleague, yung position ng ating committee dito sa katanungan nito. Is it possible that when you increase our minimum wage, magiging dahilan po ito ng tinatawag na wage price spirals?
Well, Mr. President, I believe that wage price spiral might be possible, Mr. President. However, the increase in the wage will also increase the buying capacity of the consumers, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We wanted to put on record, Mr. President, that according to 2022 IMF working paper, and if we have that in on the meron ba wala? If we can flash it on screen, Mr. President, because we know that this is very important, and we wanted to make sure that we are studying the different aspects of this particular bill. We make sure na alam natin yung sinasabi natin at dinidiscuss natin dito, no, Ginoong Pangulo. Based po dun sa 2022 IMF working paper, based on historical records, napakaliit ng posibilidad na magkaroon ng wage price spirals. Bakit po? A wage price spiral is an episode where at least 3 out of 4 consecutive quarters saw accelerating consumer prices and rising nominal wages. Dito po sa IMF study, if we can show it, yung IMF study, makikita po natin dito, no? And I'd like to share this with the body and for the record, Mr. President. It says that this study found out that number one, of the 79 episodes identified with accelerating prices and wages going back to the 1960s, wala pa ho nung historical data po nito, only a minority saw further acceleration after 8 quarters, Mr. President. If you talk about 8 quarters, it means about 2 years, meron kang transition, no? And then number 2, nakalagay po dito sa study ng IMF, inflation and nominal wage growth tended to stabilize. So magkakaroon ng stability, may stabilize din, leaving real wage growth broadly unchanged, Mr. President. And last but not the least that I'd like to share, sabi po nung study dito sa IMF, nominal wage growth normally stabilizes at levels that are consistent with observed inflation and labor market tightness. So, Ginoong Pangulo, there are studies that shows, Mr. President, that very little yung po pwedeng maganap na sinasabing inflation, etc., yung pananakot, sapagkat I was trying to listen attentively to the answers being made by our distinguished sponsor. I think yung dun sa binanggit nyo kanina, Mr. President, sa Region 10, if I'm not mistaken, yung 110 pesos, that's a lot bigger than the 100 pesos that we're talking about. Very little yung nagkaroon ng regional inflationary rate. Is that correct, Your Honor?
Yes, you are correct, Mr. President.
Mr. President, historical data would suggest that nominal wages can accelerate while inflation recedes from high level. So, gusto lang po nating ipakita dito, Mr. President, hindi lang po nakakatakot yung pananakot na sinasabi na maling kaisipan tungkol dito, but also, Mr. President, yung pong eventually ay magle-level up itong ating nominal wage growth, no? Mag-stabilize po sila, and very little yung effect na sinasabi ng mga studies na ito. Pangalawang katanungan, Ginoong Pangulo, madalas din po na argumento laban po sa pagtaas ng minimum wage ay yun daw pong unintended job losses. Mr. President, some scholars say that when labor is made more costly, employers may hire less of it. May we know, Mr. President, anong posisyon ng ating committee dito, and in this particular measure, Mr. President, are there safeguards in the bill relevant to this, Mr. President?
Mr. President, we cannot see how the recent wage hikes have impacted businesses in terms of unemployment, Mr. President. In fact, kahit nag-increase tayo ng sahod noong nakarang taon, sa katunayan, bumababa pa ang unemployment rate natin sa 4.3%, Mr. President. Also, wala po tayo nabalitaan na nagtanggal ng manggagawa ang mga negosyante dahil sa taas sahod noong nakarang taon. I don't think we see no data to substantiate this fear, Mr. President. Wala po tayong napapalitaan na nagsarang establishment because of the recent increases, Mr. President. Kapag tumataas ang sahod, mariretain empleyado sa isang kumpanya, ibig sabihin, mas mababa ang turnover rate. Importante po dahil mariretain ang current pool of talented workers, Mr. President. And despite the recent wage hikes, Mr. President, PESA is expecting to reach 250 billion in investments this year, which would translate to more jobs and more opportunity and more economic activity, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And let me offer some data here, Mr. President. Let me offer
Gladly,
some studies
Mr.
here,
President.
Mr. President. Alam niyo po, doon sa 2019 study published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, they found no evidence, Mr. President. They found no evidence of disemployment when higher levels of minimum wages are considered. I'm still hoping that our friends from the technical team can show this data that we have been saying for quite some time. Mr. President, nandito po yun, no, sa Quarterly Journal of Economics. 2019 po itong study muli at gusto natin i-cite ito pong 2019 Comprehensive Review of Minimum Wage Research. And let me share this to the body, Mr. President. The Economic Policy Institute, EPI, said that evidence suggests a muted, let me quote this, muted effect of minimum wages to date on employment, and the weight of the evidence suggests any job losses are quite small. In fact, Mr. President, sinabi po dito, and I'll say it again, in this particular this particular Economic Policy Institute study and research, it says that EPI said for every 10% change in the average wage of low-wage workers, the median employment effect across studies was essentially zero, Mr. President, distinguished colleague. So, if you look at the proposal at hand, or whatever it is right now, we are discussing in this August chamber, for example, in BARP, which is 341 pesos, an additional 100 pesos, less than 5% po ito, Mr. President, ng change on the minimum wage, Mr. President. So, again, Mr. President, to answer the argument, Mr. President, that indeed job losses will happen, hindi po natin nakikita at wala pong matibay na ebidensya that this would happen. Perhaps I would ask my last question by raising this particular issue, Mr. President, sa ating good sponsor. Bukod po ba sa wages, ito lang ba talaga yung tinitignan ng mga foreign investors, for instance? Ito po lang po ba yung tinitignan na factor ng mga negosyante, specifically mga foreign investors, para mag-invest dito at para magnegosyo sa ating bansa?
Mr. President, one minute, Mr. President.
Session suspended.
Mr. President, wage hike is not the only factor that investors are looking at, Mr. President. They are also considering infrastructure, tax incentives, utility costs, and peace and order. In fact, Mr. President, we have laws like the Create Law, which I was not yet a member when they passed it, Foreign Investments Act, Public Service Act, and Retail Trade Liberalization Act that encourages more investments to come into our country. And I believe, Mr. President, foreign investors would still go to our country because our workers are more skilled and are very professional, Mr. President.
Tama po, Ginoong Pangulo, and allow me to agree and state for the record that indeed, Mr. President, it's not just higher wages, Mr. President, yung hinahanap ng mga investors para mag-invest, para magnegosyo sa ating bansa. Malaking bagay po yung cost of electricity. Malaking bagay po yung uncertainties in regulation, government regulation, Mr. President. I have seen it, Mr. President, all my life as Chief of the Technical Education and Skills Development Authority, that when you have a skilled, competent human resources, Mr. President, hahanapin ka po talaga eh. Alam nyo, yung dun po sa discussion natin ng Magna Carta for Seafarers, talagang sa buong mundo, ang hinahanap ay Filipino seafarers. In fact, 1 out of 3 seafarers in the world Filipino. Kasi nga ho, subok na magaling, subok na masipag, yung work ethic, at talagang maaasahan. Kaya, I believe, Mr. President, na sagot natin yung mga katanungan at concerns tungkol po dito sa isinusulong natin na pagtaas ng daily minimum wage, Mr. President. And so, let me end by saying I am in full support of this measure. I'd like to thank the gentleman from San Juan for taking the cudgels in defending and sponsoring this particular measure. We congratulate him, and we are again saying that we are here to serve the best interests of our people, especially our workers. Maraming salamat, Ginoong Pangulo.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I would also like to thank our Senate President for aiding me with his own datas, and I would also like to thank Senators Risa Ontiveros, Sherwin Gatchalian, and Sani Angara for their and Senator Revilla, of course, for their interpellation. And of course, the majority floor leader. Ano masama na tingin mo sa akin? Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. There being no member who wishes to interpellate, I move that we close the period of interpellations and debates. So move, Mr. President.
There be no objection, motion is approved.
May I ask for a minute suspension, Mr.
Session
President?
suspended.
Mr. President, having closed the period of interpellations and debate, I now move that we suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 2534. I so move, Mr. President.
There being no objection, motion is approved.
Ask for minute suspension.
Session suspended.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, at this juncture, I move that we resume consideration of Senate Bill number 2492 under Committee Report number 172. This is the bill on the Philippine Maritime Zones Act. I so move, Mr. President.
There being no objection, motion is approved.
Mr. President, the parliamentary status of the measure is that we are now in the period of interpellations and debate. Mr. President, there being no member who wishes to interpellate, I now move to close the period of interpellation. So move, Mr. President.
There being no objection, motion is approved.
With the consent of the body, I move to open the period of amendments.
There being no objection, the period of amendments is now in order.
Mr. President, there are no committee amendments, and so I move to close the period of committee amendments and open the period of individual amendments and recognize the sponsor of the measure, Senator Francis Tolentino, to propose his individual amendments. I so move, Mr.
Our
President.
distinguished colleague from the great province of Cavite, Senator Francis Tolentino, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. For the individual amendments, we start with page 1, line 5, delete the phrase PCA case number 2013-19. That's on page 1. Delete the phrase arbitral award, PCA case number 2013-19, and let me rephrase it. Delete the phrase arbitration, PCA case number 2013-19, and replace the same with the words arbitral award. It would now read as follows, Mr. President. Section 2, Maritime Zones. In accordance with the 1987 Constitution and international law, particularly the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, open parenthesis, unclose, close parenthesis, and the 2016 South China Sea Arbitration Award, the maritime zones of the Philippine archipelago comprise of internal waters, archipelago, exclusive economic zone, and continental shelf, and number 2, all other territories over which the Philippines has sovereignty or jurisdiction likewise shall have their respective maritime zones as appropriate. I so move, Mr. President.
There being no objection to the amendment, amendment is approved.
Mr. President, on section 6, on page 3, in lines 1 and 2, delete the phrase of territorial sea. So it will now read as follows. Section 6, territorial sea. The territorial sea of the Philippines refers to adjacent belt of sea measured 12, open parenthesis, number 12, close parenthesis, nautical miles from the baselines as provided in Section 3 of this Act, comma, and as determined in accordance with the provisions of Part 2, quote, territorial sea and contiguous zone, unquote, Part 4, archipelagic states, quote unquote, and Part 8, quote unquote, regime of islands of UNCLOS as appropriate. The Philippines exercises sovereignty over its territorial sea and the airspace above it, as well as its seabed and subsoil, in accordance with UNCLOS and other existing laws and treaties, comma, having due regard to the rights of other states, including the right of innocent passage as provided in Part 2, Section 3 of UNCLOS. Period. I so move, Mr. President.
There being no objection to the amendment, amendment is approved.
On the same page, Mr. President, on the same page, between lines 9 and 10, and I'm referring to page 3, Mr. President, between lines 9 and 10, insert a new paragraph to read as follows. The features covered by the Kalayaan Island Group in the West Philippine Sea shall have a territorial sea of 12 nautical miles from its baselines as determined above. It will now be added as part of the same section, Mr. President. That would be Section 6 as amended. I so move, Mr. President. And the subsequent lines will be renumbered accordingly. I so move, Mr. President.
There, is it okay? Are we good? Are you following? It's a 1 minute suspension. What, no need? There being no objection to the amendment, amendment is approved, subject to style.
Thank you, Mr. President. On Section 8. Section 8, Mr. President.
Please proceed.
On the same page, Mr. President, line 4, delete the word and after the semicolon. And the same will be renumbered accordingly.
There be no objection to the amendment. Amendment is approved, subject to style.
Mr. President, on the same page, 1 minute suspension, Mr. President.
Session suspended. Please proceed, Your Honor.
Mr. President, I have an anterior amendment. This is on page 3, line 26. Page 3, line 26, section 8, to include the phrase, all other low tide elevations within 200 nautical miles from the archipelagic baselines shall likewise form part of the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. Thus, Section 8 would now read as follows. Section 8, Exclusive Economic Zone. The Exclusive Economic Zone of the Philippines refers to the waters beyond and adjacent to its territorial sea and up to the extent of 200 nautical miles from the baselines, as established by Presidential Decree 1599, otherwise known as the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone of 1978, and to the extent consistent with the other provisions of this Act and with the provisions of UNCLOS. All other low tide elevations within 200 nautical miles from the archipelagic baselines shall likewise form part of the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. In accordance with the UNCLOS, within the EEZ, the Philippines has A. Sovereign rights for the purpose of exploring and exploiting, conserving, and managing the natural resources, whether living or non-living, of waters super-adjacent to the seabed and its subsoil, and with regard to other activities for the economic exploitation and exploration of the zone, such as the production of energy from the sun, water, current, and winds, semicolon, provided that, comma, in the exercise of these rights, comma, the Philippines shall enforce its laws and regulations consistent with Article 73 of UNCLOS, semicolon. Letter B, jurisdiction with regard to the establishment and use of artificial islands, comma, installations and structures, semicolon, marine scientific research, semicolon. Number 3, protection and preservation of the marine environment, semicolon. And letter C, other rights and duties provided for in UNCLOS. I so move, Mr. President.
Okay, there being no objection to your amendment, amendments approved subject to style. Please provide the Secretariat the data that you have read, so that
Yes, Mr.
there will be no
President.
confusion.
On the same page, Mr. President, between lines 6 and 7, insert a new paragraph to read as follows. All artificial islands constructed within the Philippine EEZ shall belong to the Philippine government. One minute suspension, Mr. President.
Session suspended.
Mr. President, I reiterate the latest amendment, which I quote again: all artificial islands constructed within the Philippine EEZ shall belong to the Philippine government. I so move, Mr. President.
Very, very good amendment. There being no objection, amendments approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. And that would require the renumbering of the subsequent lines, Mr. President. On page,
Shall that include the reclamation in Manila Bay? I presume.
Mr. President, on section 9, page 4, line 7, remove the period after the word shelf and insert the words and extended continental shelf. As amended, section 9 will now read as follows: continental shelf and extended continental shelf. Section 9, to reiterate, would now read as follows: Section 9, continental shelf and extended continental shelf. The continental shelf of the Philippines comprises the seabed and subsoil of the submarine areas that extend beyond its territorial sea throughout the natural prolongation of its land territory to the outer edge of the continental margin, or to a distance of 200, open parenthesis, figures 200, close parenthesis, nautical miles from the baselines, where the outer edge of the continental margin does not extend up to that distance. I so move, Mr. President.
There being no objection to the amendment, amendments approved.
On the same page, Mr. President, line 16, after the word Philippine rice and insert the following words: hereby renamed collectively as the Talampas ng Pilipinas. And I read the amended provisions. Where the continental shelf extends beyond 200 nautical miles, 200, open parenthesis, 200, figures, close parenthesis, nautical miles from the baselines, the outer limits shall be delineated in accordance with Article 76 of UNCLOS, provided that the limits of the continental shelf beyond 200 open parenthesis, 200 in numbers, close parenthesis, nautical miles in the Benham Rice region, including the Philippine rice, hereby renamed collectively as the Talampas ng Pilipinas, as submitted to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, CLCS, and deposited to the United Nations Secretary General on July 2, 2012, are hereby incorporated into this act, provided further that this is without prejudice to the making of other submissions for other areas at a future time, and to renumber the lines accordingly.
There being no objection to the amendment.
So move, Mr. President.
Amendments approved.
On page 5, Mr. President, line 1, section 11, on page 5, section 11, line 1, before the word law, insert the word existing. Thus, section 11 will now read as follows. Section 11, Marine Scientific Research. The government shall adopt measures in accordance with Part 13, Marine Scientific Research, quote-unquote, of UNCLOS, and other existing laws and treaties, to ensure that marine scientific research, whether undertaken by local or foreign entities in the maritime zones declared herein, shall redound to the benefit of the Filipino people. I so move, Mr. President.
There be no objection to the amendment. Amendments approved.
No further individual amendments, Mr. President.
We'll just wait for the Majority Leader. Session suspended for a minute.
Mr. President, the gentleman from Cavite, Senator Bong Revilla Jr., is seeking the floor. I move that he be recognized, Mr.
Our
President.
distinguished colleague from the great province of Cavite, Senator Bong Revilla, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is just a short manifestation on maritime zones. We thank the good sponsor, Senator Tolentino, for helping shepherd this measure, which is one of my legislative priorities. With his expertise, the areas of concern were given clarity, Mr. President. Sa totoo lamang po, napakalaking hakbang ito para sa ating bayan. We know that this will reconcile existing laws and regulations that may be inconsistent with our international commitments covering our maritime zones. Ito ang magiging sandigan ng ating mga mangingisdang kinakanyon ng tubig at inaagawan ng pangkabuhayan. Malaking tulong din ito sa ating mga LGUs na kadalasang nalilito sa sasaklaw at lawak ng kanilang kapangyarihan sa ating katubigan. If this becomes law, it will carry with it an expectation of obligation on the part of the international community who will have to not only recognize but respect our nation, our laws, our rights. Marami pong nag-aalinlangan na igiit kung ano ang atin dahil para daw tayong bumangga sa pader. But with this proposed measure, Mr. President, we will have the law on our side. At naniniwala po tayo na kung kasanggan natin ang batas, taas noo nating maipaglalaban kung ano ang atin. Tayo na po mismo ang magtataas ng ating sariling bandila. Once legislated, we will be sending a message loud and clear to the international community. We mean business. Ang Pilipino po ay matiisin, ngunit huwag subukin at ang giting at pagiging makabayan natin dahil tayo ay handang mamatay para sa ating inang bayan. Maraming salamat, Mr. President.
Maraming salamat sa ating kapatid, Senator Bong Revilla.
I will associate myself, Mr. President, with the statements of our dear colleague. Matiisin tayo pero pag napuno ang salop, sabi ni FPJ, dapat kalusin. Mr. President, at this juncture, I move that we suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 2492.
Wala pa? Because of Coco. Yes.
So move, Mr. President.
There being no objection, motion is approved.
Mr. President, some administrative matters, with the consent of the body, there being no other member who wishes to interpolate on the privileged speech of Senator Jinggoy Estrada entitled Defending the Sanctity of Democratic Institutions, delivered on January 24, 2024. I move to refer the said privileged speech and all the manifestations and interpolations thereon to the Committee on Electoral Reforms and People's Participation. I so move, Mr. President.
There being no objection, motion is approved.
I move to suspend,
Session suspended.
Mr. President. Mr. President, Senator Tolentino is seeking the floor. I move that he be recognized, Mr.
Our
President.
distinguished professor, the in-house professor of the Senate, no other than Senator Tolentino.
Just a,
recognized.
thank you, Mr. President, just a short manifestation of a good news emanating from this chamber, Mr. President. If you will recall, Mr. President, several weeks ago, your committee on Justice and Human Rights initiated several investigations concerning the plight of Manang Elvira Vergara. She was blinded by her employer, the President. We got good news, Mr. President, because of the work of the members of the committee, including the entire membership of this chamber. Manang Vergara, whose tormentors were incarcerated here, just won her initial case and was awarded a huge amount by the Department of Labor. Forthcoming, Mr. President, would be the resolution coming from the Department of Justice. This just goes to show, Mr. President, that the Senate is doing its best, that the Senate is still the bastion and bedrock of Philippine justice, Mr. President. So yun lang po, gusto ko lang ipaalam sa bulwagang ito, yung nangyari po sa isang kasambahay na tinulungan ng Senado. Magandang gabi po at maraming salamat.
Maraming salamat sa ating chairman of the Committee on Justice and Human Rights. You have exceeded beyond the call of duty in many of the things that you've investigated on, and we appreciate the work that you've been doing in the Committee on Justice. So mabuhay po kayo for bringing this issue up and giving justice to the kasambahay na kailangan talaga ng tulong galing sa ating gobyerno. Salamat po. Mabuhay po kayo.
Thank you, Mr. President. With that, Mr. President, I move that we adjourn the session until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Wednesday, Hearts Day, February 14, 2024. I so move, Mr. President.
There be no objection to the motion of the Majority Floor Leader. Session is adjourned until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Wednesday, February 14, 2024. Advance Happy Valentine's, everyone.